Mary Whitmore pressed her bare hands into the snow and screamed until her voice broke, and not one soul turned back. The wagon tracks were still warm. The fire her family had made was still smoking. But they were gone. And she knew with a clarity that split her chest open that it was not an accident. She had been chosen to be left behind. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to this channel. Follow Mary's journey all the way to the end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Mary Whitmore was abandoned, she had been carrying firewood. That was the detail that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Not the cold, not the hunger that came after, not even the silence where voices used to be. It was the firewood. 6 pieces of pine wet from the snowbank pressed against her chest like a shield that couldn't protect her from anything that mattered. She had only stepped 40 feet from the wagon. 40 feet. That was the distance between her life and the end of it. When she turned back, the trail was empty. She stood there and counted the seconds the way her father had taught her to count lightning. 1, 2, 3. Waiting for the sound of wheels. Waiting for her brother Calvin to come stomping back through the drifts, cursing at her for falling behind again. Waiting for her mother's voice, sharp and impatient, calling her name the way she always did. Like Mary's name was an inconvenience she'd been carrying for 26 years. Nothing came. Only wind, only white. Only the terrible stillness of a mountain that did not care whether she lived or died. She dropped the firewood. She didn't decide to drop it. Her hands simply opened, and the pine logs fell into the snow one by one, and she stood there staring at the empty trail like a woman who had not yet been told the news of her own death. Then her legs moved. She ran. She ran until her boots broke through the crust of snow, and her ankles screamed and her lungs burned with the particular cruelty of mountain air that has no mercy for the desperate. She ran because running was the only thing left to do. She ran because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant understanding, and understanding meant accepting a truth she was not ready to hold. Her family had left without her. Her family had left because of her. The arithmetic came to her the way brutal things always do, quietly, simply, without ceremony. 6 people, 1 wagon, half rations since the Clearwater crossing. Her brother Calvin with his bad leg. Her mother with the cough that rattled like loose iron. Her father counting every pound of flour with the concentration of a man who already knew the numbers didn't add up. And Mary, 26 years old, unmarried, a schoolteacher with no husband, no dowry, no particular skill that fed anyone or fixed anything, or added a single pound of value to a wagon struggling through a December pass. She was the variable that didn't fit the equation, and someone had done the math. She stopped running when the trail bent west and the wagon tracks disappeared entirely beneath a fresh fall of snow, as though the mountain itself had decided to erase the evidence. She stood in the middle of the pass, with her chest heaving, and her hands shaking, and the wet cold working its way up through the soles of her boots, and she understood for the first time in her life what it meant to be completely alone. Not lonely. Alone. There is a difference, and it is measured in hours, not feelings. She turned back toward where the camp had been. She retraced her steps. She told herself there had been a mistake, that they had moved ahead, thinking she was already in the wagon that Calvin had miscounted, that her mother had assumed her father had checked. She built the story carefully, the way she had always built things, with words neat, logical, defensible. The story didn't survive the second hour, because the camp, when she reached it again, told her everything she needed to know. The fire ring was kicked apart deliberately, not in haste. The ashes were spread. Someone had taken the time to scatter them so that no heat remained. And beside what had been her sleeping spot, tucked against the base of a pine, with the careful precision of a person leaving something they had thought about, was a single flour sack, half full, enough for maybe 4 days if she was careful, enough to feel like a gesture toward conscience without being enough to feel like a genuine attempt to save her. Mary picked up the flour sack and held it with both hands and did not cry. She had learned very young that crying was a luxury available to women who had people to see it. Out here alone, tears were just water leaving her body, and her body was already running low on everything it needed. She thought about what her father had said at the Clearwater crossing 3 weeks ago, when Mrs. Halden's wagon had broken an axle and the question of whether to wait for repairs had split the group in two. "Sentiment is a fine thing in a warm house," he had said. "Out here, it's just another weight you can't afford to carry." She had thought at the time he was talking about Mrs. Halden. She understood now that he had been practicing. The first night alone on that mountain was the longest thing Mary Whitmore had ever survived. She built a fire she knew how to do. That much had learned it from watching the way women learned most survival skills through observation rather than instruction. She wedged herself against a boulder that broke the wind, and she fed the fire carefully, and she talked to herself in a low voice, reciting the names of her students back in Millhaven because it was the only prayer she knew how to say anymore. Thomas Aldrich, Clara Beeson, Henry Cole, Dora and William Fenn. She got through the alphabet twice before sleep took her somewhere she didn't want to go. She dreamed of her mother's hands. Then she dreamed of nothing. She woke to gray light and a fire gone to ash and cold so deep it felt like something with teeth. The second day was worse than the first because hope had not yet died but was beginning to understand its situation. She rationed the flour. She packed snow into her coat pockets and let her body heat melt it because her canteen had frozen solid during the night. She tried to follow the wagon tracks west, but the snow had deepened overnight and the trail was gone, and she made 3 decisions in the first hour of walking, and 2 of them were wrong, and by midday, she didn't know which direction she'd come from. By the 3rd day, she had stopped talking to herself. By the 4th, she had stopped thinking clearly. She was sitting in the snow just sitting, which is the thing that kills people on mountains. The sitting when she heard the sound. Not wind, not trees, something rhythmic, deliberate. Hoofbeats. She looked up, and through the gray curtain of blowing snow, she saw a shape moving toward her, and her mind, operating now on something below rational thought, could not immediately process what she was seeing. It was large. It was moving with purpose. It had a rider. And just behind it, loping through the drifts with a scarred face and yellow eyes, was a hound that looked like it had survived things no dog should survive. The horse stopped 8 feet from her. The man on it looked down. He was big in the way that mountains are big, not impressive so much as simply present a fact of the landscape rather than a feature of it. He had a coat that had seen more winters than Mary had been alive, and a hat that had been reshaped by weather into something entirely its own. His face was the kind of face that had stopped expecting anything from the world a long time ago and had consequently stopped being disappointed by it. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has not yet decided what to do with. Then he said, "You're still breathing. That's inconvenient." Mary stared at him. "What?" she said. Her voice came out wrong, thin, and cracked like ice that had been walked on too many times. "Means I have to make a decision," the man said. He didn't move off the horse. "Dead I ride past. Breathing I got a problem." "I'm not your problem," Mary said with more dignity than she had any right to, given that she was sitting in the snow with flour paste frozen to her coat and tears she hadn't noticed on her face. "No," he agreed. "But you're gonna be." He swung down from the horse in a single motion and crouched in front of her, and looked at her the way a man looks at something he is calculating the weight of. Not unkind, not kind either, just assessing. "How long?" he said. 4 days, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness, more like the adjustment a man makes when he revises a calculation upward. "Feet," he said. "I can't feel them." He reached out and took her boot in both hands without asking permission, and pressed his thumb hard against the side of her foot. She felt nothing. He did it again harder. Still nothing. He stood up. "You'll lose one or both," he said, "if we don't move in the next hour." "I'm not," she started. "I ain't asking," he said. He lifted her like cargo. That was the only word for it. Not gently, not cruelly, just efficiently, the way a man lifts something that needs to be moved from one place to another, and sentiment has no part in the transaction. He set her across the front of the saddle and swung up behind her and turned the horse and didn't say another word. The hound fell in behind them without being called. She learned his name from the inside of his cabin. It was carved into a board above the fireplace, not decoratively, but practically the way a man marks property he intends to keep. E. Callahan. Below it, a date. Below the date, 2 smaller letters she couldn't read in the firelight. Callahan, she said. He was cutting her boots off. Not unlacing them, cutting them because the leather had frozen to her skin, and unlacing would take time they apparently didn't have. He had a knife that looked like it had been made for exactly this kind of work. "You got a name?" he said without looking up. Mary Whitmore." "Where were you headed, Mary Whitmore?" "Oregon," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same space. "Long walk from here," he said. "My family." She started and then stopped, because she didn't know how to finish that sentence in any way that didn't end with the word left, and she was not ready to say that word out loud to a stranger. He looked up at her then. Just for a second. His eyes were the color of the sky just before a storm, not threatening exactly, just heavy with things that hadn't fallen yet. "They leave you," he said. She didn't answer. "Ain't a question," he said. "I read trails for a living. 4 days back, this storm's direction wagon train came through the pass. 1 set of small boot tracks breaking away from the group. No tracks returning to the group." He went back to the boot. "Weren't an accident?" "No," Mary said quietly. "It wasn't." He pulled the boot free. It came off with a sound she would remember for a long time, and began working on the other one. His hands were completely steady. "You got family anywhere else?" he said. "No." "Friends who'll come looking?" "No." "Money?" "The flour sack," she said, "which I dropped when your horse startled me." He was quiet for a moment. "Gone now," he said. "I know." He cut the second boot free. He set both boots beside the fire. He went to a shelf and took down a tin and came back and began doing something to her feet that hurt with the particular specificity of sensation returning to flesh that had thought it was done with sensation forever. She bit down on the sound that wanted to come out. "Don't be quiet on my account," he said. "I've heard worse." "I'm not being quiet on your account," she said through her teeth. "I'm being quiet on mine." He glanced up at her again, that same adjustment in his expression, the revision upward. "What do you want in return?" Mary said. "For this, for the shelter. What do you want from me?" He sat back on his heels and looked at her with the directness of a man who had never found social pleasantries worth the effort. "Work?" he said. "I don't run a charity. You want to stay, you contribute. Cooking, cleaning, whatever needs doing. You don't contribute, you go back out in the snow." He paused. "That's the deal. No negotiation." "And when spring comes," she said, "when spring comes, you're free to do whatever you want. Go to Oregon. Go to hell. Makes no difference to me." "You make that sound like a kindness," she said. "It ain't kindness," he said. "It's arithmetic." She thought about her father saying the same word at the Clearwater crossing, and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "All right," she said. "I'll work." He nodded. He went back to her feet. "Callahan," she said after a moment. "Ethan," he said, "since we're apparently going to be sharing space for a while." "Ethan," she said, "what are those 2 letters carved under your name on the board?" The hands on her feet stopped for just a second. Then they started again. "Nothing you need to know yet," he said. And Mary Whitmore, who had spent 4 days dying on a mountain and was now sitting in a stranger's cabin with the feeling coming back into her feet like fire, decided that yet was a word worth remembering. Because yet meant there was a story. And yet meant he might someday tell it. And that small word, that single fragile syllable, was the first thing she had been given in 5 days that felt like something other than subtraction. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls like something trying to get back what it had lost. Inside, the fire held. And Ethan Callahan worked in silence, and Mary Whitmore sat in the half-dark, and neither of them knew yet what the arithmetic of the months ahead would demand from them. But Winter knew. Winter always knows. The yet stayed with Mary longer than the warmth did. She turned it over in her mind through the first full night in Ethan's cabin, the way her students used to turn over difficult words, testing the edges, checking the weight, deciding whether it was something they could trust. Yet, not never. Not none of your business. Yet. Which meant a door existed somewhere, even if she didn't have the key. She slept on a bedroll near the fire that he had laid out without being asked, and she slept the way the nearly dead sleep, without dreams, without motion, without any awareness of time passing, until the light changed and the smell of something cooking pulled her back to consciousness with an urgency that embarrassed her. She sat up. Ethan was at the stove. He didn't turn around. "Sit," he said. "Feet aren't ready to take weight yet." "I need to sit," he said again in the same tone, and she understood that this was not a man who repeated himself as a courtesy. The first time was information. The second time was a wall. She sat. He brought her a tin bowl of something that was mostly water and dried meat and what might have been turnip, and he set it in front of her and went back to the stove and did not watch her eat. She was grateful for that. She had not eaten in 4 days, and she was not able to eat with dignity, and she knew it, and she appreciated not being witnessed in the knowing. When the bowl was empty, she set it down and said, "Thank you." He said nothing. "I mean it," she said. "I know you mean it," he said. "Doesn't require a response." She looked at the back of him, the width of his shoulders, the way he moved around the small space with the economy of a man who had learned exactly how much room he needed and had stopped requiring anything beyond it. And she tried to take his measure, the way she had always taken her students' measure reading, what people didn't say, as carefully as what they did. What Ethan Callahan didn't say was considerable. "What do you need me to do?" she said. He turned then, looked at her feet still wrapped in cloth he had bound them with the night before. "Nothing today," he said. "Maybe tomorrow." "I don't want to be useless," she said. "You're not useless," he said. "You're injured. Different thing. Useless is a choice. Injured is just a fact." He turned back to the stove. Learn the difference. She did not know what to do with a man who said things like that. Her father had never made a distinction between injured and useless. Her father had never made a distinction between anything that slowed the wagon and anything that stopped it. She spent the first full day learning the cabin. Not exploring, she didn't move far from the fire, but observing. That was a skill she'd had her whole life, the skill of a woman who understood that information gathered quietly was worth more than information demanded openly. The cabin was a single room, with a sleeping loft above and a root cellar below. The shelves held more than she'd expected. Dried meat flour salt. A row of tins she couldn't identify. Dried herbs bundled in twists that hung from the rafters above the stove. Tools along one wall. All of them in working order. All of them in the specific position of things that get used regularly and returned exactly. The hunting hound, she hadn't learned its name yet, wasn't sure it had one, lay near the door, and tracked her movements with yellow eyes that held a calm, comprehensive distrust. "What's the dog's name?" she asked. "Dog," Ethan said. She waited for more. More did not come. "You named your dog Dog," she said. "He knows what he is," Ethan said. "Doesn't need a reminder." Mary looked at the animal. The animal looked back at her with the serene confidence of something that had never once in its life doubted its own usefulness. "Fair enough," she said. The first test came on the third day. Her feet had recovered enough to take weight, not comfortably, not without pain, but enough, and Ethan had set a task before her with the same energy he might set a trap, without ceremony, without instruction, and with the clear expectation that she would either figure it out or she wouldn't, and either outcome would tell him something he needed to know. He had left a haunch of venison on the table and gone outside. No words, no directions. Just meat and a knife and an implicit question. Mary stood in front of it for a long moment. She was a school teacher. She had prepared lessons, graded compositions, argued grammar with 11-year-olds who would rather have been anywhere else. She had not, in the course of that career, broken down a deer haunch into anything resembling useful portions. but she had watched her mother do it. Once, maybe twice. She picked up the knife. She was still working when Ethan came back in 3 hours later, smelling of cold and pine, and something copper that she assumed was blood from whatever he'd been doing out there. He stopped in the doorway and looked at what she'd produced, and she straightened and looked back at him, and dared him with her eyes to say a single word about it. The portions were uneven. The waist was higher than it should have been. The cuts bore almost no resemblance to anything a real butcher would recognize. He walked to the table and looked at it in silence for a long moment. Then he said, "Edible," and went to wash his hands. Mary had been complimented on her teaching. She had been praised for her penmanship, her piano playing her ability to explain long division to children who didn't want to understand it. None of those compliments had ever produced in her the particular fierce satisfaction of the word edible from a man who looked like he had never once said something he didn't mean. She started to feel something dangerous. She started to feel like she might be able to do this. That was the thing about survival. It had a seductive quality she hadn't anticipated. Every small competence felt enormous. Every task completed was a flag planted in hostile territory. She was not thriving. She was not comfortable. But she was functioning, and after 5 days in the snow functioning, felt like a victory worth defending. Then she burned the stew. Not slightly, not correctable. Entirely catastrophically, with a smell that filled the cabin and had dog on his feet, and Ethan through the door in under a minute. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. She was standing with the stirring spoon in her hand, and an expression she could feel was equal parts mortification and defiance. "I got distracted," she said, by what he said. She did not tell him she had been reading the carved board above the fireplace for the 100th time, trying to decode the 2 letters below his name. She had been close. She'd climbed halfway up the loft ladder to see them better, and the stew had happened. "It doesn't matter," she said. "It matters to dinner," he said. He went to the shelf. He took down dried meat. He sat at the table and began eating it cold and without complaint, and without a single look in her direction that carried more than the baseline information of his presence, which somehow was worse than anger would have been. "You could be angry," she said. "About burned stew," he said. "About any of it," she said. "You didn't ask for this. You didn't ask to bring me here or feed me or any of it. You could be angry." He looked at her across the table with those storm-colored eyes and said, "Getting angry about the weather is a waste of fuel." "I'm not the weather," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're more trouble." But there was something at the edge of his voice, something so faint she might have invented it, that sounded almost like dry humor. Almost. She ate dried meat and did not apologize for the stew again. The 3rd week was when the real shape of it began to emerge, not the arrangement. The arrangement had been clear from the start. Her labor for his shelter, nothing more, nothing less clean and transactional and without pretense. No, what emerged in the 3rd week was something underneath the arrangement. A rhythm. The particular rhythm of 2 people who have stopped performing around each other because performance is expensive and resources are limited, and eventually, even the most stubborn human beings prioritize warmth over dignity. She learned his schedule without being told it. He was up before dawn. She could hear him moving before the light changed the specific sounds of a man who had been waking alone for long enough that he'd stopped moderating the noise of it. He fed dog first, then the fire, then himself, but only after both those things were done, which told her something about the hierarchy of his obligations that she filed away carefully. She started waking up earlier, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. She was simply gradually already at the stove when he came downstairs from the loft, the fire already banked up the coffee she had found the coffee tin on the 4th day, and hoarded that knowledge like currency already heating. He noticed. He said nothing. But he sat down at the table and wrapped both hands around the tin cup, and something in the line of his shoulders shifted in a way she had learned to read as acknowledgement. She learned his silences. This was harder and more important than learning his schedule. Ethan Callahan communicated primarily in silences, and those silences were not all the same. There was the working silence, dense and self-contained, the silence of a man fully occupied. There was the watchful silence, lighter, with a quality of attention underneath it, the silence of a man noting things he hadn't decided what to do with yet. And there was what she had started privately to call the heavy silence, longer, different in texture, carrying weight she couldn't identify the source of. That silence appeared without warning, usually in the evenings, and it had the quality of a door closing in a house that had too many closed doors already. She didn't push at the heavy silence. She had pushed at it twice in those first weeks, and both times he had simply gotten up and gone outside despite the cold, and returned an hour later with the silence replaced by the working kind. And she had understood that some things were not going to be pried open by conversation, and that this was not a personal rejection of her, but a structural reality of him. But the letters above the fireplace continued to bother her. She had gotten close enough eventually to read them. ECMC Ethan Callahan, and someone else whose first name began with M. Below the initials was a date, not the year Ethan had presumably built the cabin, because the board was too weathered for that. An older date, 6 years ago. She didn't ask, she stored it. And then came the night that changed the weight of everything. She was almost asleep, the particular almost asleep of exhaustion, where consciousness thins out, and the edges of things go soft when she heard him. Not talking, not moving. Something else. A sound she recognized, not because she had heard it from this man before, but because she had heard it from herself those first nights in the snow before she'd learned that crying was just water leaving her body. He was upstairs in the loft, and Ethan Callahan, who had shown not one fracture of anything resembling vulnerability in the weeks she had lived under his roof, was making the sound of someone who was fighting something they were losing. She lay completely still and breathed and did not move. Because she understood the way women who have been the weaker party in every room they've ever entered understand that witnessing this without his knowledge was one thing. Acknowledging it was another thing entirely. And acknowledging it without permission was something that could not be undone. She lay still until it stopped. She lay still for an hour after it stopped. In the morning he came downstairs and the working silence was in place like a wall freshly rebuilt overnight. And she handed him his coffee and said nothing. And he said nothing. And she watched him from the corner of her eye, drink it with both hands wrapped around the cup, the way he always did. And she thought, MC, someone he had loved. Someone who was gone. And she thought, this is why the cabin has no softness in it. Not because he was born without the capacity for it. Because he removed every piece of it after she left. The fourth week brought the first real confrontation. It started over wood. She had been stacking the split logs the wrong way. She hadn't known there was a wrong way, she had simply stacked them in the configuration that seemed logical, which was apparently a configuration that would result in the outer logs rolling loose, and the whole stack collapsing in a wind. And Ethan came around the side of the cabin and looked at it and said with the flatness of a man stating a physical law, "That'll fall." "It's fine," she said. She was cold and her hands hurt, and she had been stacking wood for 2 hours, and she did not want to hear that it'll fall. "It won't hold," he said. "It's held so far." "Wind picks up tonight," he said. "It'll fall." "Then I'll restack it tonight," she said. "You'll restack it now," he said. And something in her, the part that had been patient and practical and adaptive for 4 weeks straight, the part that had eaten burned resentment with every cold dried meat dinner, and swallowed every instinct to argue, and bent itself into the shape required for survival. That part reached its limit with a speed that surprised even her. "You do not give me orders," she said. The air between them shifted. Ethan looked at her, not with anger, which she could have handled, but with that calm, comprehensive attention that she had come to understand was far more dangerous than anger because it gave nothing away and took everything in. "This is my property," he said. "And I am not your property," she said. "We have an arrangement, labor for shelter. That arrangement does not include you speaking to me like I'm one of your traps. I'm speaking to you like someone who's built 6 wood piles on this mountain and knows how they fall," he said. "Then teach me," she said. "Don't command me." The silence that followed was different from any of the silences she had catalogued. It had the quality of something being evaluated, weighed, turned over by a mind that did not move quickly, but moved very thoroughly. "Fine," he said. He walked to the woodpile. He picked up 3 logs and repositioned them without comment, and then he looked at her and waited. She picked up 3 logs and mirrored what he'd done. He adjusted one of them, moved it 2 inches to the left, without a word. She moved the next one 2 inches to the left, without needing to be told. They restacked the woodpile together in the wind and the cold without speaking, and when it was done, it was different from anything she would have built, alone, sturdier, tighter, with an interlocking logic she could feel in the structure, even if she couldn't fully explain it. And he looked at it and said nothing, which she had learned to read as approval, and she looked at it and felt the same fierce satisfaction as the word edible, but larger. "You've done that before," she said. "Taught someone." He was already walking back toward the cabin door. "Once," he said. He went inside, and Mary stood beside the woodpile they had built together and looked at the solid, interlocked, wind-resistant structure of it, and thought about MC, and thought about the heavy silence, and thought about a man who said once the same way other men might say a long time ago, in a different life, when I was someone else. She thought about all of that, and then she went inside because the wind was picking up, because Ethan had been right about that, and being right about the wind was the kind of thing that mattered more than being right about anything else out here. That night, she made the stew correctly. He ate it without comment, which was the highest compliment available in the language they were both slowly learning to speak. Dog looked at her from beside the door with those yellow eyes, and she thought she might have been wrong. She was probably wrong, but she thought something in his expression had shifted 2 degrees in her direction. Not trust. Not yet. But the absence for the first time of active suspicion. And on a mountain in the deep of a winter that did not care whether any of them survived it, the absence of active suspicion was its own kind of warmth. The stew being right changed something, not dramatically, not in the way that stories like to mark change with declarations or gestures, or a single moment that everyone in the room recognized as significant. It changed the way mountain weather changed gradually then, all at once, and by the time you noticed it, it had already been true for longer than you'd realized. Ethan started leaving tasks for her without the implicit question underneath them. Not testing anymore, just delegating. There was a difference, small but structural, between a man who sets a task to see if you'll fail and a man who sets a task because he's decided you probably won't. She felt it. She didn't comment on it. Commenting on it would have been like pointing at a wild thing. To show someone else the pointing was the thing that made it disappear. She learned to cure hides. He showed her once the same way he showed her everything. No excess words, no patience for confusion, but no cruelty either. Just the information laid out with the efficiency of a man who measured everything by whether it would survive winter. She ruined the first hide. He said nothing. She did the second one correctly, and he picked it up and turned it in his hands and set it back down, and that was that. She learned to set a snare. She learned which wood burned longest and which burned hottest, and why you needed both, and couldn't always have either. She learned that dog had a hierarchy of alertness. Ears forward meant attention, ears flat meant threat. That particular sideways lean meant Ethan was coming back from a direction he didn't usually come from, and that reading dog was often faster than any other form of available intelligence. She was learning, in other words, to live in this place. And that terrified her in a way the cold never had. Because the cold wanted to kill her. That was clean. That was understandable. But this slow, competent daily absorption into the life of a mountain she'd never planned to know, this was something with no clear edge, and she could not see where it ended. She still thought about Oregon sometimes. Less than she used to. The first crack in the surface of Ethan Callahan came without warning. On a Tuesday, she was keeping track of days in charcoal marks on the inside of her boot, a habit that kept her tethered to time, in a place where time moved differently, and it came because of a name. She had been sorting through the root cellar when she found it. A small wooden box fitted with a latch pushed to the back of the lowest shelf behind a row of winter squash that had seen better decades. She wouldn't have opened it. She was not by nature a woman who opened things that weren't hers. except that when she lifted it to move it, the latch gave and the lid swung up, and she looked at what was inside before she could decide not to. A woman's hair comb, blue enamel, painted flowers along the spine. The kind that came from somewhere east, somewhere that had stores and windows, and the specific luxury of objects made for beauty rather than use. Under the comb, a folded piece of paper. She did not read the paper. She looked at it, at the handwriting visible through the fold, round and careful and clearly feminine, and she set it back and closed the latch and put the box exactly where she had found it, and she finished sorting the root cellar and came back upstairs and did not say one word about any of it. But she thought about it all day. She thought about it while she was starting the fire. She thought about it while she was checking the snares she'd set along the east side of the cabin. She thought about it through dinner, which was salt pork and the last of the turnips eaten in the working silence that had become in its strange way almost comfortable. And then because she had never been a woman who could hold a thing indefinitely without it finding a way out. "Who was she?" Mary said. Ethan's fork stopped moving. The silence that followed was not the working kind. It was not the heavy kind she'd identified before. It was a new kind, the kind that happens when something reaches something it's been guarding for a long time and isn't sure what to do now that it's been found. "You went through my cellar," he said. His voice was careful in a way it was never careful. "I was sorting your winter stores," she said, "like you asked me to. The box opened on its own." She paused. "I didn't read the letter." Another silence. "Her name was May," he said. "May Callahan." He set his fork down. "My wife. Mary Heard was, not is. Not my wife who left or my wife back in town. Was." The past tense of a living person is a particular weight, and she felt it settle into the room. "I'm sorry," she said. "6 years ago," he said. "Fever took her. Winter, same as this one." He picked his fork back up. She liked that comb. Said it was the one thing she brought from Ohio that still looked like Ohio. He ate. She ate. The fire did what fires do. "The letters on the board," Mary said. "EC and MC." "Yeah," he said. "That's why the cabin has no—" She stopped herself. He looked up. "Say it," he said. "That's why it feels like someone took something out of it," she said carefully, "and didn't replace it, on purpose." He looked at her for a long moment with those heavy pre-storm eyes, and she held the look because she had learned that looking away from Ethan Callahan in moments like this was the same as retreating, and she was finished retreating. "She used to put wildflowers in a tin on the windowsill," he said. "Even in winter she'd find something. Pine boughs, red berries, something." He looked back at his plate. "After I took the tin down." Mary did not say "I understand" because she didn't, not fully, and saying "I understand" to a grief she hadn't earned felt dishonest. Instead she said, "She sounds like someone who made things beautiful even when it was hard to." Ethan said nothing for a long time. Then, "She was the most stubborn woman I ever met," and the way he said it, not as criticism, but as the purest form of admiration available to a man who didn't have many forms, told Mary more about May Callahan than a letter could have. "She would have liked you," he said, and then he stood up and took his plate to the wash basin, and the conversation was over, snapped shut, as cleanly as a trap. But something had been left on the table between them that neither of them picked up, and neither of them put away. That was the first crack. The second one came faster. 3 days later, Mary's leg gave out. She had been on the roof he'd sent her up to check the weight of snow accumulation on the east side, a task he'd assigned with his usual zero additional commentary. And she had been moving along the ridge when her right foot went through a soft patch and her leg followed, and she came down hard on her knee against the edge of the eave and was on the ground before she'd entirely processed falling. She heard Ethan hit to the ground running from wherever he'd been. He was beside her before she'd gotten a full assessment of the damage, crouching in the snow, with his hands already checking the leg. The same clinical efficiency he'd applied to her frostbitten feet, fast and thorough and impersonal, except that his hands were not quite steady, and she noticed and she filed it. "Can you move it?" he said. She moved it. Pain, but the kind that meant bruising rather than breaking. Yes, she said. He exhaled. It was a very specific exhale, the kind that has been held for long enough that releasing it is almost audible in more than just the physical sense. You're all right, he said. He said it like a statement, but it had the syntax of relief. I'm all right, she agreed. He didn't move immediately. He stayed crouching beside her with one hand still at her knee and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been here before. Not this exact moment, but the category of moment, the standing over someone you're losing category, and was discovering that it hit the same no matter how much time had passed. Ethan, she said quietly. Yeah, he said. I'm all right, she said again. Differently this time. Not reporting a physical fact, telling him something else. He stood up. He helped her up. He kept one hand at her elbow all the way back to the cabin door, which was the most sustained physical contact that had existed between them since the first night he'd worked on her feet, and neither of them commented on it, and neither of them moved away from it. Inside, he made her sit. He checked the knee again more carefully this time, and she watched his face while he worked, because his face was where the information was. He had the focused expression of competence, but underneath it, briefly imperfectly concealed, was something she recognized, because she had been carrying its cousin since the day she'd opened that wooden box. He was scared, not of the injury. The injury was nothing. He was scared of what the injury had reminded him of, and the reminder lived in a place that 6 years hadn't been enough to fully close. You need to stop going up on the roof alone, he said. He was not looking at her. He was wrapping her knee with the same cloth he'd used on her feet. Someone has to check the east side, she said. I'll do it, he said. You can't do everything, she said. I've been doing everything for 6 years, he said. There was no self-pity in it, just facts. I know, she said. But you don't have to now. His hands stopped. He was still not looking at her, but she could see the line of his jaw and the particular stillness that preceded him deciding something. That's a temporary arrangement, he said. I know, she said. He looked up. Do you? He said. And that was the question that had been sitting underneath the arrangement since the beginning, patient as the mountain itself. Do you know this is temporary? Do you know you are leaving in spring? Do you know that nothing being built here, no rhythm, no competence, no shared silence, no grief laid on a table and left between two people, none of it is permanent? I know, she said again. But this time the word had a different texture, and they both heard it, and neither of them was entirely sure what it meant. The wound in her knee kept her off heavy labor for 4 days. Those 4 days rearranged everything, because Ethan, who did not know how to be idle, and did not know how to let someone else be idle without it, meaning something was wrong, found himself in the position of running the cabin's outdoor work while Mary ran the indoor work, and the result was an efficiency that neither of them had planned, and that neither of them knew how to address without acknowledging that they had become in some functional sense a unit. He came in one evening with a brace of rabbits, and she had dinner already started, and he stopped in the doorway for just a second, just a half second, barely measurable, before he came inside, and she saw the stop and did not comment on it, but felt it land somewhere in her chest. She was humming. She hadn't realized she was humming until she heard it stop, when she heard his footsteps. She'd been humming something she used to play at the schoolhouse piano, a piece she'd played so many times. The fingers remembered it, without the mind and the silence. After the humming was the loudest thing in the room. Don't stop on my account, Ethan said. She didn't answer. She stirred the pot and kept her back to him and felt warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the stove. You play, he said. Piano, she said. Or I used to. There wasn't a piano in the wagon. He hung the rabbits. He was quiet for a moment. May played. Not well, but she played. Something almost light moved through his voice. She used to sing to herself while she worked. Didn't know she was doing it. Always same 3 songs. What songs? Mary said. He told her. 2 of them she knew. The third she'd never heard, and he hummed 4 bars of it with a natural unself-consciousness that she suspected he was entirely unaware of, And then he seemed to hear himself and stopped. She didn't smile. She didn't look at him. She gave him every courtesy of the working silence while he processed what had just happened, which was that Ethan Callahan had in the space of 4 days told her his dead wife's name, admitted to fear in the space between his hands, and hummed 4 bars of a song in front of another person. He cleared his throat. "Rabbits need skinning," he said. "I'll do it," she said. She could do it now. She'd learned. He knew she'd learned. The offer was its own kind of statement, and they both understood what was being said, and neither of them translated it into words because some things survive longer unspoken. Then came the night that broke the last of the careful structure. She woke to Dog on his feet at the door, not the ears forward of attention, or the ears flat of threat, something in between the alert of something unfamiliar. She was off the bedroll before she'd consciously made the decision to move, and she crossed to the door and put her hand on Dog's neck and felt the hair raised along his spine. "Ethan," she said not loudly. Silence from the loft. "Ethan," louder. She heard him move. He was down the ladder in 4 seconds. She hadn't known until that moment that he slept with his boots on, but apparently he slept with his boots on with the rifle that lived above the loft in his hand, and fully awake in a way that suggested he'd been closer to the surface of sleep than she'd thought. He read Dog in one glance. "Stay inside," he said. "What is it?" she said. "Stay inside," he said again, and was through the door. She stayed inside for approximately 45 seconds. Then, she took the hunting knife off the shelf she'd noted where it was 3 weeks ago and opened the door. She heard it before she saw anything. A sound between a snarl and a scream. The particular sound of something large and in pain, and therefore very dangerous. Then Ethan's voice sharp and commanding, directing Dog to the left. Then a crash that she felt in the soles of her feet. She moved toward the sound. What she found at the edge of the tree line was a wolf. Massive gray one leg caught wrong in a hidden fall, maddened with pain, and fighting the ground itself, and Ethan between her and it, and Dog circling at the edge of the wolf's range, and the rifle aimed with the steadiness of a man who has done this before, and knows exactly how close is too close. "I told you to stay inside," Ethan said. He did not look at her. He did not move the rifle. "I know," she said. "Then why are you here?" She thought about that for half a second. "Because you might need someone behind you," she said. He didn't answer. He made the shot clean, singular, final, and the sound of it went up into the dark and came back as silence, and the wolf was still, and Dog stopped circling and sat down with the philosophical calm of something that had done its job. Ethan lowered the rifle. He turned around. He looked at her standing there in the snow in her nightclothes, with a hunting knife in her hand, and an expression she could feel on her own face, and was fairly sure was equal parts terrified and entirely unapologetic. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, "You're a damned fool," he said. "Maybe," she said. "Could have been killed," he said. "So could you," she said. Another silence. This one had a quality she didn't have a category for yet, something with heat in it, something that wasn't quite the heavy silence and wasn't quite the working silence, and wasn't quite anything she'd catalogued before. "Go inside," he said. His voice was different, lower, less wall, more something she couldn't name. "Ethan, please," he said. It was the first time he had said please to her. In weeks of arrangements and tasks and carefully transactional exchanges, he had never said please, because please implied the other person had a choice, and everything between them until now had been presented as fact rather than request. Please was a fracture. Please was a man who had just looked at a woman standing in the snow with a knife to back him up and felt something he didn't have the infrastructure to process right now and was asking for time. She went inside. She put the knife back on the shelf. She rebuilt the fire. She sat and waited, and Dog came in after a while and lay down beside her with his chin on her knee, which he had never done before, and she put her hand on his scarred head and thought about all the things that had just shifted and could not be unshifted. Ethan came in 20 minutes later. He set the rifle back in its place. He stood by the fire with his back to her for a long moment. "She did that too," he said finally. "May. Couldn't tell her to stay put. Couldn't keep her anywhere she didn't want to be." Mary said nothing. "I used to think it was the most aggravating thing about her," he said. He turned around and looked at her with Dog's head still on her knee and the firelight doing things to the shadows of the room, and something in his face had shifted into territory she didn't have a map for yet. "Used to," he said, quietly, like a man deciding something. And Mary Whitmore, who had been left in the snow to die and had survived by arithmetic and stubbornness, and the particular mercy of a man who had almost convinced himself he didn't have any mercy left, looked back at him across the firelight and understood that the winter which they had both thought was something to survive until spring had become something else entirely. Neither of them said it. But Dog's tail moved once slowly against the floor, and the fire held. Neither of them named what had changed. That was the agreement they made, without making it the silent contract layered underneath the original one, the labor for shelter arrangement that had started this whole impossible winter. They didn't speak about the wolf night. They didn't speak about used to. They didn't speak about the way Dog had put his chin on her knee, or the way Ethan had looked at her across the firelight, like a man reading a map of territory he'd sworn he'd never enter again. They just woke up the next morning and went back to work. But the work was different now, and they both knew it. It was in the small things, the way he moved around her in the cabin, without the careful maintenance of distance he'd kept for the first weeks, the way she stopped waiting to be assigned tasks and simply did what needed doing, and he stopped checking whether she'd done it right. It was in the coffee which she now made strong, the way he liked it, without having to remind herself to, and in the way he came in from the cold and knocked the snow off his boots before crossing to the stove, which he hadn't done in the first weeks, but did now reliably without comment. It was the accumulation of 100 small adjustments that two people make when they have stopped being strangers and have not yet decided what they are instead. Dog slept beside her bedroll now. Every night, without being invited, he crossed from his place by the door and settled at her feet with the authority of something that had made a decision and considered the matter settled. Ethan watched this happen the first time and said nothing. The second time he watched it happen and looked away before she could catch his expression. By the third time, he had stopped watching at all, which meant he'd accepted it, which meant something she wasn't going to press at. January deepened into the kind of cold that had opinions. She knew now what Ethan had meant those first weeks when he moved with that particular urgency about firewood and stores and the specific angle of the cabin's ventilation. The mountain in January was not the mountain in December. December was dangerous. January was personal. It came at you with the deliberateness of something that had noticed you specifically and had decided you were interesting. He was gone longer on his trap lines. The animals were moving differently in this cold, deeper, less predictable, and the math of their food stores required him to range further than he liked. She felt his absence differently than she had in the early weeks when his absence had simply been a relief from the pressure of his presence. Now, his absence was a different kind of pressure, one that sat in the middle of her chest and didn't release until she heard his boots on the step. She didn't tell him that. She was fairly sure he knew. The morning the real trouble started, he left before dawn. He told her he'd be back by midday. He took Dog. He didn't always take Dog, but this line went further east where the terrain was rough, and Dog's nose was worth more than a second pair of eyes. And he left her with the fire and the stores and the list of tasks that had stopped being a list and started being just the shape of her days. Midday came. No Ethan. She kept working. She reminded herself that by midday, on a mountain in January, was an estimate, not a promise, and that Ethan Callahan was not a man whose absence meant catastrophe simply because it exceeded his projection by an hour. 2 hours past midday. She checked the fire. She checked the stores. She went to the door twice and looked at the trail he usually came back on and saw nothing, and came back inside and told herself the story of all the reasonable explanations. Longer trap line, difficult terrain, an animal that required more tracking than expected. She believed the story right up until the moment she stopped believing it. That moment came when the temperature dropped so fast She felt it shift inside the cabin through the walls, a pressure change that the mountain produced when it was gathering itself for something serious. She had lived here long enough now to read that change. It meant weather. It meant the kind of weather that didn't ask permission. She went to the door and looked at the sky, and her stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. The storm came in from the northwest like something that had been building for weeks and had finally made its decision. Not the gradual darkening and thickening of a normal winter storm. This was fast and certain, and it came with a wind that arrived before the snow did a warning that carried all the mercy of a door being slammed. Ethan was still on the mountain. She stood in the doorway and felt something she had no name for. Not fear, exactly. Not the fear she'd felt when she was dying in the snow, which had been a purely personal fear, a fear about her own ending. This was larger and worse because it was about someone else's ending, and there was nothing she could do about it except stand here and wait and be useless. She was not going to be useless. She rebuilt the fire to its maximum. She moved every piece of firewood from the exterior stack inside, all of it, armload by armload, until the interior of the cabin was stacked to the ceiling on one side, and her arms were shaking from the weight of it. She filled every vessel she could find with snow and set them near the fire to melt, because she didn't know what state he'd be in when he came back, and water would matter. She found the medical tin he kept on the third shelf. She knew where everything was, now had mapped this cabin as thoroughly as she'd ever mapped anything, and set it on the table where it would be immediately accessible. She did all of this in 40 minutes. Then she sat down, and there was nothing left to do, and the storm hit the cabin like something with a grievance. The wind came first. Then the snow so thick, it turned the world outside the window into a solid thing. Then the cold, which came in under the door, despite the rug she'd wedged against it, and around the window frame despite the oilcloth. She sat by the fire and fed it steadily, and thought about the arithmetic she was trying not to think about. Ethan knew this mountain. He'd been working these trap lines for 6 years. He had survived every winter this range had produced since May died, and he'd stayed here alone with his grief and his dog and his carved board above the fireplace. He was not a man who died easily. She had watched him be difficult to kill in small ways since the first night, and the accumulation of that evidence argued strongly for his survival. But the storm was not interested in her arguments. The storm had its own arithmetic. She was halfway through the 3rd hour she had marked the time on her boot, a habit that had become reflex when dog hit the door. Not knocked. Hit. 3 sharp impacts that were nothing like his usual communication with the door, and everything like something urgent being relayed from the other side. She was on her feet and across the cabin before she'd finished processing the sound. She opened the door, and the storm came in with a violence that stole her breath, and Dog was there without Ethan alone, with his fur matted with ice, and his eyes carrying the particular frantic intelligence of an animal who has something to tell you, and needs you to be smarter than you currently are. "Where is he?" she said. Dog turned, looked at her, turned again toward the trail. "Show me," she said. He was gone back into the storm before she'd finished the words, and she went after him with the lantern she'd had the presence of mind to grab and Ethan's second coat over her own, because she'd had the presence of mind to think of that too, and the storm accepted her into itself with no ceremony whatsoever. She followed Dog by sound more than sight. The lantern was almost useless in the blowing snow, but she held it anyway, because the alternative was darkness, and darkness would mean losing Dog, and losing Dog would mean losing Ethan. She kept her free hand extended for the trees she knew were there, and used them to orient herself, and kept moving, and did not think about what she would find at the end of this. She found him 40 yards into the tree line. He had made it that far back on his own. She understood that later, reconstructing the timeline, the way she'd always reconstructed student problems backward from the result to the cause. He had made it 40 yards back toward the cabin, on a leg that had been torn open at the thigh by something she identified later as a trap he'd stepped through when the snow covered the marker. He'd placed his own trap, which was the kind of thing the mountain did when it wanted to demonstrate irony. He was on the ground sitting against a tree with his coat pressed against the wound, and his face the specific gray of a man who had been bleeding and cold for long enough that his body was beginning to negotiate with the idea of stopping. She got down in the snow beside him, and he opened his eyes and looked at her, and said with the absolute flat economy of a man past the point of social convention, "I told you to stay inside." "You tell me that every time," she said. "It has never once worked." Something moved through his face. Might have been the beginning of something that would have been a smile under different circumstances. "Can you walk?" she said. "If you help," he said. "Left leg won't take full weight." "Then we go slow," she said. "Dog." Dog was already at Ethan's right side. Good. Getting him up was the hardest physical thing she had ever done in her life, and she had had a hard winter. He got his right arm over her shoulders, and she took as much of his weight as her frame could manage, and Dog pressed against his left side like a counterbalance, and they moved through the storm in the specific awkward three-beat rhythm of people who are figuring out how to move together under conditions neither of them designed for. He said nothing during the walk back. She felt him managing the pain by the quality of his breathing, controlled, deliberate, the breathing of a man spending significant resources on not falling, and she matched her steps to his without being told to, and kept talking low and steady. Not about anything important, but just the sound of a human voice being something to follow when the storm wanted to take all the direction out of the world. "When we get inside," she said, "you're going to sit, and you're going to let me look at it, and you're not going to argue with me. That's the arrangement." "That's a new arrangement," he said through his teeth. "The original one needed revision," she said. He made the sound that lived in the same place as a laugh. They made it back. The cabin door was the best thing she had ever felt under her hand, and she got him inside and got the door shut against the storm and got him to the table where she needed him. And that was when she let herself breathe all the way, for the first time since she'd opened the door and found Dog alone. What she found when she got the coat away from the wound was bad. Not unsurvivable. She had learned in this winter to calibrate bad on a scale that had been significantly recalibrated from her Ohio schoolteacher scale, but bad enough that she understood immediately why he'd gone down, and why Dog had come for her, and why his face was still gray, even in the heat of the cabin. "I need to close this," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I've never done it before," she said. She said it looking directly at him because she had decided that winter that the most dangerous thing was not information. The most dangerous thing was making decisions without it. "I'll talk you through it," he said. "Can you do that clearly? You're losing too much." She had the cloth from the medical tin pressed against it with both hands, and she could feel the insistence of it through the cloth. "I'm clear enough," he said. His voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "You're going to need the needle and the black thread, top tin left side." She found it without taking her hands off the wound. She had organized that tin 2 weeks ago, had reorganized it actually from the arrangement that seemed to assume the user would be working alone into an arrangement that assumed someone else might need to locate things under pressure. Ethan had noticed the reorganization and said nothing, but she'd seen him look at it, and look at her, and do that upward revision. "The whiskey," he said. "Shelf behind you." "I know where it is," she said. "For the needle," he said. "I know," she said. "I also know it'll help you." "I don't need to be, Ethan," she said. "Let me make one decision without a debate." A pause. "Fine," he said. She worked for the better part of an hour, and he talked her through all of it with a precision that she understood was costing him something, not just physically, but the particular cost of having to be clear and directed when the body wants to be anything but. He told her how deep and what angle and when to stop, and she followed the instructions with the focus of a woman who understood that the instructions were the only thing standing between this man and a different outcome. And she did not think about the needle in her hands or what the needle was doing, and she did not think about anything except the next step, and then the next step, and then the next. When it was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd done, and waited for her hands to shake. They shook. She put them flat on her thighs and breathed until they stopped. "You did good," Ethan said. She looked up at him. His color was marginally better. His eyes were fully present. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, Something unguarded, something that hadn't had time to reassemble itself into the usual careful neutrality. "Don't tell me I did good like I'm one of your hounds who found a trail," she said. "I'm telling you," he said with the slow deliberateness of a man choosing words that are exactly true, "that you just did something most people couldn't have done, and you didn't flinch, and I've watched men with 10 years of mountain living on them fall apart at less." He held her gaze. "That's what I mean." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "Thank you." She helped him to his bedroll. He couldn't manage the loft, not tonight, and she pulled his boots off the same way he had pulled hers off that first night, without asking permission, because there was no time in the equation for permission. And she covered him and added wood to the fire, and Dog settled against the length of him with the warm solidity of something that has been doing this job longer than anyone asked it to. She sat in the chair beside the fire. She was not going to sleep. He'd lost enough that she needed to watch him through the night, needed to know he stayed warm and stayed breathing, and that the work she'd done held. She was not going to sleep. She sat, and the storm raged at the walls, and she watched the rise and fall of Ethan Callahan's chest, with the focused attention of a woman who had recently discovered that the arithmetic of this winter was not at all what she'd originally calculated. She had come here with nothing. She had stayed because she had no choice. Somewhere between then and now, without her consent or her planning, the arithmetic had changed. She could not identify the exact calculation, could not point to the stew that came out right, or the woodpile they'd built together, or the wolf, or the 4 bars of hummed song, or the way he'd said used to by the fire, but the sum was different from the sum she'd started with. And now he was on her floor, and she was watching him breathe, and the storm was trying to take the cabin apart, and she understood with the clean and terrifying clarity of arithmetic done correctly that when spring comes, you're free, was a sentence she no longer knew how to interpret. Free to go where? Free to go back to what? Free to be the variable that didn't fit the equation, except that somewhere in this winter, without asking anyone's permission, she had become a variable that did. She did not say any of this. She said none of it. She sat and watched him breathe, and the fire held, and Dog's ear twitched in his sleep, and outside the storm made its arguments to the mountain, and the mountain, as it always did, simply waited for them to finish. Ethan's eyes opened once around what she estimated was 3 in the morning. He looked at her in the chair. He looked at the fire. He looked at her again. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. "Mary," he said. Her name plain without the miss he'd used those first weeks without the careful management of the full Mary Whitmore. Just Mary, like something he'd decided had belonged in his mouth for a while, and he was only now letting himself use it. "Sleep," she said. "I've got the fire." He held her gaze for a moment longer, then he closed his eyes, and she sat in the chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the man she had saved, and the fire she was keeping, and the door the storm was still arguing with, and she thought that the arithmetic of this winter had produced a sum she hadn't solved for. But it had produced it nonetheless. And sums once arrived at do not unarrive. The storm broke on the 3rd day, not gently. The mountain didn't do anything gently. It broke the way Ethan broke things, with finality, without ceremony, leaving behind a silence so complete it had physical weight. Mary heard it happen in the early morning, that particular shift in pressure, when the wind stopped arguing and simply left, and she sat up in the chair where she had spent 3 nights, and listened to the quiet, and felt it settle into her bones like something earned. Ethan was awake. He'd been in and out for 2 days, fever taking him under for hours at a stretch, then releasing him back to consciousness, with the grudging reluctance of something that had wanted him longer. She'd managed the fever with the knowledge she had, which was incomplete, and the supplies available, which were limited, and the stubbornness she'd been developing since December, which was by now considerable. He looked at her from the bedroll with eyes that were clear for the first time in 48 hours. "Storm's gone," he said. "Yes," she said. He assessed her with the comprehensive look she'd learned to read as his version of asking how she was. She had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 3 days. She was aware this was visible. "You stayed up," he said. Someone had to watch the fire, she said. Mary, don't, she said, not unkindly. Don't tell me I didn't have to. We both know what happens to a fever that goes unwatched in a cabin this size in a storm that lasted 3 days. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. Plain, no qualifications. She nodded. She got up and went to make coffee, and her legs were stiff from the chair, and she didn't let him see how stiff. He was sitting up by the time she brought it to him, had hauled himself upright against the wall, which had cost him. She could see it in the set of his jaw. And he took the cup in both hands, the way he always did, and drank it, and said nothing for a while, and she sat in the chair and drank hers. And they were quiet together, in the specific way of people who have been through something and don't need to talk about it to know they've been through it together. The leg, she said eventually. You need to tell me honestly. It'll heal, he said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her over the cup. It'll take time. Won't be right for weeks. Maybe longer. How much longer? Long enough, he said. Past when you'd planned to leave. She held his gaze. I hadn't planned anything specific. Oregon, he said. That was the plan. That was the plan in December, she said. It's February. He set the cup down on the floor beside him. His eyes were doing the thing they did when he was calculating something and didn't yet know the answer. Things change in February, he said carefully. Things change in February, she agreed just as carefully. Dog walked between them and lay down with his back against Ethan's good leg, and his chin pointed toward Mary. And she thought not for the first time that Dog was significantly smarter than either of them, and had been for a while. The recovery was slow, and it made Ethan difficult. She had expected this. A man who moved through the world with that particular physical authority, who measured himself in terms of what he could carry, and how far he could range, and how long he could work in conditions that would stop most people. That kind of man made sedentary by injury became a specific kind of trouble. Not cruel, not deliberately, but compressed, like a fire with too much fuel and not enough air. He was a poor patient. He tried to stand on the leg 2 days too early, and she told him to sit down, and he told her he'd been managing his own recovery for years before she arrived on his mountain. And she told him that his management had apparently included stepping through his own trap in a blizzard. So perhaps some outside perspective was warranted, and the silence that followed that had a quality she'd only encountered once before. The charged specific silence after lightning, when the air isn't sure what to do next. Then he sat down. She went back to what she was doing and allowed him the dignity of the moment by not looking at his face. You have a point, he said. She had been prepared for almost everything except that. I know, she said, keeping her voice neutral with effort. Don't get smug, he said. I'm not smug, she said. I'm vindicated. There's a difference. The sound he made then was unambiguously something she had never heard from him before, brief, low escaping before he could stop it. A laugh. Not the echo of a laugh, or the shape of one, or the almost kind that occupied the same space. An actual laugh, small and quickly controlled, but real, and it hit her somewhere in the chest, like a hand pressed flat against a door she'd thought was sealed. She turned around and looked at him. He was looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has just discovered something about himself that he wasn't prepared to discover. She turned back to the stove before he looked up. But she was smiling, and they both knew it. He healed by increments visible and hard-won. She watched it happen the way she'd watched everything about him carefully, without appearing to filing away each small return of capacity as information. The 3rd day, he could stand without assistance. The 5th day, he walked to the door and back without the wall. The 7th day, he went outside alone briefly for the first time and came back with color in his face and something lighter in his eyes. She didn't tell him she'd stood at the window and watched every second of it. He didn't tell her he'd known she would. It was in those recovery weeks that they began to actually talk, not the functional exchanges of the arrangement. Not the careful revelations that had come one at a time, like a man handing over pieces of something valuable and checking each time whether he'd given too much. Real talk, the kind that happened after supper when the fire was settled and Dog was asleep, and the evening had nowhere particular to be. He told her about the mountain the way someone tells you about a place they've stopped trying to explain to people who don't understand it. She told him about Millhaven, about the schoolhouse and her students, and the particular small world she'd been good at building before her family had decided she was a variable that didn't fit. "You miss it," he said. "Some of it," she said. "The children, the work." She paused. "Not the rest." "The rest being your family," he said. "The rest being the one who didn't fit anywhere," she said. "The sister who didn't marry. The daughter who cost more than she returned. The teacher who was adequate at teaching and a liability at everything else." She looked at the fire. "Out here, I'm not a liability. Out here, I'm—" She stopped. "Useful," he said. She looked at him. "Out here you're useful," he said, and the word in his mouth was not a small word. She had learned that by now. She had learned that Ethan Callahan's words were dense with more than their surface, that edible meant well done, and useful meant something closer to necessary, and yet had meant something she was still unpacking months later. "You made yourself useful," he said. "Nobody gave that to you. You built it." She held on to that for a long moment. "You taught me half of it," she said. "I gave you the information," he said. "You decided what to do with it. Different thing." She thought about her father, who had given her a flour sack and called it provision. She thought about Ethan, who had given her a knife and a venison haunch and an implicit question and stood back and let her answer it. "Yes," she said. "It is a different thing." The twist came on a morning in late February, when everything Mary thought she understood about how this would end revealed itself to be insufficient. She had gone through the root cellar, a routine accounting of stores, the kind she did every 2 weeks now, to keep ahead of what they needed, and she found on the bottom shelf, behind the remaining winter squash, that the wooden box with May's comb in it had been moved. Not taken. Moved. It was now on the shelf above at eye level, no longer pushed to the back. And the latch, which had given way accidentally before, had been deliberately closed. She could tell the difference. The deliberate close had a particular alignment. The accidental give didn't produce. He had moved it. He had moved it from where things were stored to where things were kept. She didn't know when. She couldn't ask how. She came back upstairs and set her accounting notes on the table, and Ethan looked up from the harness he was mending. His hands could manage fine work, even while the leg was healing. He'd been mending things for 2 weeks, filling the enforced stillness with the work available to him, and he looked at her face and looked back at the harness. "I moved the box," he said, without preamble, without her having spoken. "I know," she said. "May wouldn't have kept it in the dark," he said. "She would have kept it where she could see it." He set the harness down. "I've been keeping it in the dark for 6 years because I told myself that was the same as keeping it. It isn't." Mary sat down at the table. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." "She's not gone because I put her things away," he said. He said it like a man saying something he'd been saying to himself in the dark for weeks and had finally decided to say out loud. "She's gone because she's gone. The box in the dark doesn't change the math." "No," Mary said. "It doesn't." He picked the harness back up. His hands were steady. "I'm not saying this to explain anything to you," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it because it needed saying out loud," he said. "To someone." He looked up at her. "And you're the someone who's here." She looked back at him and thought, no. No, that was not quite right, and they both knew it wasn't quite right, but she wasn't going to correct him yet. She was going to let him have the pace of this. She had learned in this winter that some things moved faster when you stopped pushing at them. "I'm glad I'm here," she said, carefully. "Exactly that much. No more." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He went back to the harness. She went back to her accounting. Dog's tail moved once against the floor. March arrived, and with it the first suggestion that the mountain's position might be negotiating. Not warmth, not yet, not anything that deserved the word warmth, but a quality of light, that was different from February's light, a degree or two of something possible in the air that hadn't been there before. She noticed it first. She always noticed these things first because she was paying attention to the mountain in a way she hadn't been in December when the mountain had been trying to kill her, and she had been too busy surviving to learn it. Ethan noticed her noticing. "First week of March you can feel it," he said. "Light changes before the temperature does." "Like a warning," she said. "Like a promise," he said. "Mountains slow to keep it, but it keeps it." She thought about that. She thought about promises the mountain made and kept slowly. She thought about the way the word promise sounded in his mouth, different from the way most men used it, heavier, more considered the word of a man who did not make them casually because he understood the weight of keeping them. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah," he said. "What happens in spring?" she said. "When the pass opens." He was quiet for a long enough moment that she thought he might not answer. "Traders come through in April," he said. "Headed to the valley settlements. They'd take you as far as Junction." He paused. "From Junction, you could get to Oregon by summer." She looked at her hands on the table. "Is that what you want?" she said. Another silence. The careful kind. The kind that meant something was being weighed with the full weight of a man who knew the difference between weight and pressure. "What I want," he said, "and what's right for you to have are not guaranteed to be the same thing." She looked up at him. "What if they were?" she said. He met her eyes across the table, and she held it and did not look away, because this was the moment she had been building toward since the first night she'd sat in this cabin with burning feet and nothing to her name, and she was not going to flinch at it now. "Mary?" he said. His voice had that quality it got when he was about to say something true at cost. "Tell me what you want," she said. "Just that, just the truth of it." He put his hands flat on the table. He looked at them. He looked at her. "I want you to stay," he said. The words were simple, and they were enormous, and he said them the same way he said everything that was true, without decoration, without hedge, without the social cushioning that men used when they were afraid of the answer. She breathed. "Then I'll stay," she said. "It's a hard life," he said immediately, not celebrating, not softening. She loved him for that. She understood in that moment that she loved him specifically for the refusal to make things easier than they were. "It's a mountain in Wyoming, and a cabin that leaks when the snow melts, and trap lines, and hard winters, and—" "Ethan?" she said. He stopped. "I've been here since December," she said. "I know what it is." "You know what winter is," he said. "Summer's different. Spring's different. There are months here when the isolation—" "Do you hear yourself?" she said, not unkindly. "You're arguing against your own answer." His mouth stopped. He looked at her with the expression she'd catalogued months ago as the upward revision and never found a better name for. "I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else to go," he said. The real thing, finally. The sentence underneath all the other sentences. "I want you to stay because you want to be here, not because the snow kept you, not because the arithmetic worked out, because you—" He stopped again. "Because I want you," she said. He looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "I do," she said. "I want you, and I want this, and I want the trap lines, and the hard winters, and dog on my feet, and—" She felt something coming loose in her chest, something she'd been holding tightly for a long time. "And the woodpile and the stew, and the way you say exactly what you mean without dressing it up, and the way you taught me to do things instead of doing them for me, and the way you said May's name the first time you let yourself say it to me." She stopped. Her voice had done something she hadn't given it permission to do. "I want all of it. The hard and the good. Both." He stood up from the table. He was still favoring the leg, and probably would be for weeks yet, and he crossed to her with the specific, careful movement of a man navigating around an injury, and he stood in front of her, and she stood up to meet him, and he put his hands on either side of her face with a gentleness she had not known he was keeping anywhere until right now. "You are," he said low, "the most stubborn woman I have ever met in my life." "You said May was the most stubborn woman you'd ever met," she said. "I was wrong about who held the record." he said. She laughed. She hadn't known until that moment that she had been waiting for exactly that, to laugh in his hands in this cabin, with Dog raising his head from the floor, to look at them with yellow eyes that held the benevolent assessment of something that had known how this ended before either of them did. He kissed her the way he did everything, without waste, without pretense, with the complete attention of a man who understood that what was in front of him was worth the full weight of his presence. She kissed him back the same way. Dog put his head back down. Spring came the way the mountain had promised it would. Slowly, then fully, with the particular defiant abundance of a season that had been suppressed for months and was making up for the time. The snow retreated. The pass cleared. The first traders came through in the second week of April and stopped at the cabin the way traders had always stopped at this cabin, for water, for news, for the particular currency of human contact in a country that didn't offer much of it. The trader, a man named Horace Gill, who had the look of someone who had seen most things and stopped being surprised by them years ago, looked at Mary where she stood beside Ethan in the open doorway, and then looked at Ethan, and then looked back at Mary. "Thought you ran alone up here, Callahan," he said. "Used to," Ethan said. "Ma'am?" Gill said, touching his hat brim in Mary's direction. "Mr. Gill," she said. "Heading to Junction, then south," Gill said to Ethan with the careful neutrality of a man who wasn't going to ask the obvious question directly. "If anyone needed passage." Ethan looked at Mary. Mary looked at Ethan. "We're fine where we are," Ethan said. Jill looked between them one more time and then nodded with the comprehension of a man who had been reading situations for 30 years and read this one in under 10 seconds. "Good enough," he said. "I'll stop on the way back through if you've got trade." "We'll have furs," Ethan said. "Come back in 6 weeks." Jill moved on. Mary and Ethan stood in the doorway and watched him go, and then they stood there a moment longer because the morning was doing what early spring mornings did on this mountain, which was remind you that the world could be extraordinary if you were in the right place to see it. "You could have gone," Ethan said. He said it quietly, and it wasn't a question, but it wasn't quite a statement either. It was the thing he would always offer, she understood now. The door held open because he was not a man who could live with himself if the choice hadn't been free. "I know," she said. "Junction to Oregon isn't—" "Ethan," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I'm exactly where I want to be," she said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into the side of him that was healed and solid and warm, and Dog pressed against her leg from the other side, and the three of them stood in the doorway of the cabin that had been grief and survival and arrangement, and had become, without anyone planning it, something else entirely. Inside, on the shelf where Ethan had moved it, May's blue enamel comb caught the morning light. Not hidden, not put away. Kept in the place where things were kept, the place where things were honored for what they had been while leaving room for what was still to come. She had reorganized the medical tin. He had moved the box. Between the two of them, they had made something new out of what the winter had left behind. That evening after supper, after the fire had settled into its working rhythm, she hummed without realizing she was doing it. The piece from the schoolhouse piano, the one she'd played until her fingers remembered it without her. She hummed it into the quiet of the cabin, and the quiet received it, and Ethan sat across from her with his hands on the table, and his eyes on the fire, and after a moment, so low it was barely sound, he added the 4 bars of May's song, where the melody paused, not replacing hers, just filling the space her melody left, the way 2 rivers meet and become the same water. She did not stop humming. He did not stop. Dog's tail moved against the floor in the slow, certain rhythm of something that has exactly what it needs. Mary Whitmore had been abandoned in the snow with a flour sack and a family's arithmetic that didn't include her. She had survived a mountain that hadn't asked her opinion. She had learned to cure hides and stack wood and close wounds and read silences and love a man who communicated primarily in what he didn't say. She had not arrived at this life. She had built it with her hands and her stubbornness and 4 days of dying in the snow. And every morning after coffee, first fire, second, then whatever the mountain required, And Ethan Callahan, who had spent 6 years keeping his grief in the dark and calling it preservation, had opened a door he'd nailed shut, not because the mountain had made him, not because the arithmetic had required it, but because a schoolteacher from Ohio had walked into his silence and refused steadily, and without apology, to leave it the way she'd found it. They were not a perfect sum. They were not a clean equation. They were two people who had both been reduced to their least, and had chosen in that reduction to build toward something rather than away from it. And that the choosing the choosing when it was cold, and when it was hard, and when the sum wasn't clear yet, that was what made it real. That was what made it home.